Okay, let me just make sure this is where, okay. Really, it was so great yesterday. I want to thank you people. I don't think I've had a happy day like yesterday and last night in a lot of years. I really mean that, since I had two legs anyway. So thank you again, and thanks to the library and everybody else and my wife for orchestrating this. And I'm feeling so good, my wife better be careful tonight. Uh, Actually, she's mad at me. I want you women to say if I'm wrong. We start talking last night, all right, what if you die, I die, and it usually seems I'm going to die first, isn't it? Because women drive us to an early grave, so normally. So anyway, I said, hey, what if you die first? What if I die first, she said. So, yeah, would you remarry? Come on, honestly. Well, yeah, okay. She said, well, now, two more questions, maybe three. Would you give your new wife my jewelry? I said, yeah, what am I going to do with your jewelry? I'm not the type of guy. Would you give your new wife my car? I said, yeah, yes. All right, really tough question. Would you give your new wife my golf clubs? And I said, no, she's left-handed. I wondered how that, and then she was also mad at me. She thinks I have a thing for Nancy Pelosi with all those pictures. I said, I'm too good. I'd never date a Democrat. That gets edited out next year. Okay. All right, let me review quickly, and I won't, no more jokes. Remember Douglas sponsored the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act really brings on a Republican Party because it destroys the Whigs within a couple of years. The Whigs were pretty well going downhill anyway. It split the Democrats really north and south, and that would eventually allow the Republicans to win in 1860. And the Republicans, of course, were created as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And I hope I made that clear enough that when you had 10,000 people at a meeting, as they did throughout the North after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. That was amazing. I mean, to get 10 people had to travel by horseback and by foot. I mean, it was really something. And the Republicans, anybody calls them a third party is wrong. They emerged immediately as not only a second party, but really in a lot of ways the strongest party in the United States. So the election of 1856 that I'm going to talk about now, and there's a birther issue there. There's going to be nativism. A lot of ways it reminds you of the present day. The election of 1856 has been getting a big uplift lately because there's so many similarities. Not only the Republicans making their debut, but the between nativism being so important and birtherism and all kind of stuff. So let's. And Bleeding Kansas and Bleeding Sumner will come in there. And then I'll get into the Lincoln Douglas debates, and then I'll go to some more pictures on the. There's some more pictures relating to the next election in 1860. 1856 will be the first time the Republicans run a candidate. Name was John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, who was very, very important in surveying the West. He was very powerful in California. He was part of the Bear Flag Revolt up around Sacramento and San Francisco area during the Mexican War. He stayed in California. Gold was discovered on his land, and he became very wealthy. Fremont was one of California's first senators when we were admitted as a state in 1850. The other senator was Dianne Feinstein. That was her first term. Okay. Okay. But anyway, yeah, he was a very prominent Californian. He was married to Thomas Hart Benton, was a very famous Democratic senator, still alive. He was married to Jessie Benton, Thomas Hart Benton's daughter, and she was I think I did briefly show her picture. Oh, I'll do it again. She was America's sweetheart, Doris Day of the 19th century. I have that up there, yes. And they were the power couple, Fremont, and she ran his campaign, kind of surreptitiously because women were supposed to be seen and not heard, literally. But she was a well-published woman, well-educated, one of the first feminists, really, in a quiet sort of way. She ran his campaign, and Ulysses Grant, who later became a famous general and president, he was asked about her running his campaign, and he said she had to because he was too stupid to run it. And they once asked him, why didn't you vote for Fremont? He said, simple, I met Fremont. Fremont had an ego problem. He was, I think, a little overrated, but he was considered very handsome and very dynamic. He was a military hero, and in these days, military heroes were often elected president. We haven't had one since Eisenhower, but 10 former generals, 10, have been elected president of the United States, and that's a very big recruiting ground. And Fremont was never made a general, but he did serve in the Mexican War. He served in the Civil War, and Lincoln had to fire him because he won a couple battles. He lost a couple, but he won a couple battles early in the Civil War, and then he took it upon himself to free the slaves. And you couldn't do that. And Lincoln was doing everything he could to keep some southern states from getting too rambunctious and leaving the Union. Many had, but there were still 4 slave states in the Union, 5 if you count West Virginia. And Lincoln was all upset about Fremont just arbitrarily freeing the slaves. And eventually he was also canned from the Army during the Civil War. Okay, but anyway, in 1856, the big question was, who would become the rivals to the Democrats? Would it be the newly organized Republican Party that was already so powerful, even though it was only created in 1854? And somebody asked me a question as I left yesterday. Where was the Republican Party actually created? It was either in Jackson, Michigan. There was a meeting of about 8,000 people. Ironically, Jackson was the founder of the Democratic Party. But there was a meeting in Jackson, Michigan, and another one in Ripon, Wisconsin, where there's a nice college right now. Those were the 2 biggest meetings at that early on after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. And both of those towns claimed to be the home place of the modern Republican Party. Okay, but anyway, in 1856, the question was, who was going to be the next challenger to the Democrats, who were still the preeminent party? Was it going to be the Republicans or the Know-Nothings or the American Party? Who were the Know-Nothings? The Know-Nothings, who by 1856 called themselves the American Party, they were, very simply put, at first a secret organization. They had emerged really in the 1830s and 40s as semi-secret, and whenever you asked a know-nothing or an American or a nativist, what do you stand for? They were pledged to say, I know nothing, so that we gave them the nickname the Know-Nothings. I once wrote a paper, one of my first papers I ever had published, called The Know-Nothings in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. I'm so proud I gave it to my mother, and she wouldn't talk to me for a month because she said I was saying that people in my home county didn't know anything. Now, that was true, but anyway, so the Know-Nothings, they were anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant, and that's another nativist. They believed that America should be ruled by Americans. They wanted to restrict immigration. Until the 1920s, until 1921, we had no restriction on immigration of white people in any way. None, zero. Anybody could come in from any place at any time, and we never had any immigration restriction on Mexicans, incidentally, or any Latin Americans until 1965. So our immigration laws are very much misunderstood in a lot of ways. But in 1856, the Know-Nothings called themselves the Native Americans, eventually the American Party. They were almost as hot as the Republicans. So the question was, the Republicans stood for non-extension, the Know-Nothings or the Americans stood for nativism, immigration elimination, if not at least immigration restriction, and they were very anti-Catholic. Now, why was that important? When we were founded as a country, only about 2% of Americans were Catholic, only about 2%. That meant 98% had no chance of going to heaven. All right, you Protestants, laugh at me. We have heaven, hell, purgatory, limbo. Well, we used to have limbo. That's been out. That's out. I'm a good old Catholic. I remember going to church on Sunday or Sundays. I remember it was a sin to eat meat on Fridays. Yeah, sin date a Protestant girl, and I said to the sister Hilda, I said, when you look like me, you date anybody you can. We're Catholic, Muslim. Okay, but anyhow, they were anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant, particularly anti-Irish. Between 1845 and 1855, 3 million immigrants came in the United States. By 1860, the census of 1860, just before the Civil War, by the census of 1860, 15%, just under 15% of all Americans were foreign born. That's the highest percentage we've ever had. It ties with 1910. So all of a sudden, and most of those 3 million immigrants who came in between 1845 and 1855 were Catholic because they came from Ireland, which the Catholic part of Ireland, because of the potato blight. Ireland was devastated by a terrible, just collapse of the potato crops through a disease called, the blight, and that occurred almost every year for 10 straight years. Ireland in 1845 had 3 times as many people as it has now. Ireland still today doesn't have as many people as it had in 1845. So many people died. They're estimated close to 1 million. And a lot of Irish, if they could scrape up the money, came to the United States. And almost all of them that came were Catholic. The only other significant group that came over between 1845 and 1855 or the Civil War were Germans. And the original Germans, there were a lot of Germans in the United States from day one. In fact, Benjamin Franklin thought we were going to adopt German as our native language, as our official language, which of course we never adopted even English. But Benjamin Franklin... No, we haven't. We don't have an official, but Benjamin Franklin honestly thought, he was from Pennsylvania, and many people spoke German. He thought German would become so we had a lot of Germans, but the difference was, especially after the revolutions of 1848, the 48er Germans who came over after revolutions in various parts of Germany. There was no united Germany. There were like 39 different provinces that made up something loosely called a Germanic Confederation. But there was no united Germany or the Second Reich until 1871. But anyway, for the first time, some of these Germans, not all of them, some, a small percentage, but some of them were Catholic. Most of the Germans who came over earlier were Lutheran, Reformed types, so they were Protestants. But the Germans who came over after 1848, a lot of them were Catholic. So all of a sudden, we went from a country in 1776 of 2% Catholic. All of a sudden, Catholics were popping up everywhere, and the Irish were particularly obnoxious to the native Protestants because the Irish spoke English, so they assimilated a little more quickly than the Germans. The Germans also tended to become farmers and spread out. But the Irish all tended to live in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and they all voted Democrat for the most part, and they became very influential in the Democratic machines. So a lot of the nativists did not like the Irish because of their political influence. You heard about those signs, "No Irish need apply." Help wanted, no Irish need apply. My grandmother always said that was stupid because the Irish won't work anyway. You know the jokes. Wherever you have 2 Irishmen, you'll always have a 5th. But seriously, you could joke with the Irish. They take it well, partly because they know damn well they saved civilization, so we're all just jealous. And that's probably true. Okay, so anyhow, who was going to take over? Was it going to be the nativists, the American Party, to challenge the Democrats? It was going to be the Republican Party. The American Party stood mainly for immigration restriction, anti-Catholicism. The Republicans stood for non-extension of slavery into the territories, right? The Democrats favored slavery. They favored the South, and they favored the extension of slavery into the territories, or at least not absolutely abolishing slavery or preventing it in the territories. So in 1856, you had 3 parties: the Democrats, challenged by the American Party, and the Republicans. And who was going to emerge? All right, so there were a couple incidents that occurred, but let me get to I'll get you the candidates, aren't I? Yeah. The Republicans ran John C. Fremont, who I mentioned, the Pathfinder, great military hero, and the American Party, or the Know-Nothings, ran former President Millard Fillmore. He had been a Whig president between 1850 and 1853. He was now a Know-Nothing, and he was the Know-Nothing candidate. He was, in fact, he claimed he really wasn't a Know-Nothing, and they said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I don't know." But this is the truth. Queen Victoria met him and called him the most handsome man she ever met. And Queen Victoria, she said, if I were ever going to have an affair, it'd be with Fillmore. I mean, I'm not going to, I don't say he was ugly, but he was darn well aesthetically challenged. No, he was okay, I guess. What am I, judging men here? It's not. All right, but anyhow, Millard Fillmore was the Know-Nothing candidate, and ironically, he had just returned to the United States from a tour of Europe when he accepted the nomination, Know-Nothings. You know what his last stop was to visit a head of state? He visited the Pope. So he left Europe after a meeting with the Pope and came back and accepted the Know-Nothing or anti-Catholic nomination. And reason anti-Catholicism was really strong in these days, not only because the Irish especially were beginning to threaten the political balance by voting in a bloc for the Democrats, but the Pope at the time, Pius IX, who somehow, and I'll challenge any Catholic on this, including myself, he's now a saint. I don't know how. If he's a saint, I ought to be a saint. But Pius IX was a very controversial pope. He's the longest serving modern pope from 1846 to 1878. He believed that only Catholics could go to heaven. I'm serious. He's the guy that convened the First Vatican Council a little later on. We eventually had the Second Vatican. But he also insisted that the First Vatican Council adopt the theory of papal infallibility, which we still as Catholics are sworn to obey. But that doesn't mean if the Pope tells me to root for San Francisco in a Super Bowl, I have to. It pledges any Catholic, and I'm not saying I do, but any Catholic is supposed to believe that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, from the chair, in other words, on religious matters, he's infallible. And also, Pius IX made Jews live in ghettos. He ruled part of what Italy, about half of what is now Italy. They were called the Papal States. He was literally the absolute monarch of the Papal States, and he forced all Jews living in Rome or anywhere else to be in ghettos. So he was a very, very controversial pope. And that's another thing that fueled anti-Catholicism in the United States. And the Democrats nominated President, or soon-to-be President, James Buchanan. I'm from Pennsylvania originally. He's our only Pennsylvania president. He was probably the most qualified guy ever to become president on paper. He was everything, a congressman, a senator. He was ambassador to Russia, ambassador to England. He was everything. Old Buck, they called him, the Buckaroo, and he was in England as ambassador to England during the Kansas-Nebraska screaming, so he was Kansasless. And the Democrats wanted to nominate somebody who was not directly involved in the Kansas controversy, and since he was in Europe, he was perfect, because he had nothing directly to do one way or the other with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Plus, he was a doughface. He was a northern man from the pivotal state of Pennsylvania, which had the second most electoral votes to New York at that time. And he was also a sympathizer with the South. So he was a doughface. Perfect. Kansasless, a doughface. He'd be the Democratic candidate, and he favored, of course, popular sovereignty in the territories, but it was well known that he was pro-South. And the only rumor against him is that he was perhaps gay, and he was. And there's nothing against to have a gay son I'm very, very proud of. He's a dean, and I couldn't be prouder of anybody. But Buchanan, yeah, I think he was. All the evidence is. And they say if you walk like a duck and quack like a duck and have feathers like a duck and hang out with a duck, you're damn well a duck. And his boyfriend was a guy named William Rufus Devane King, and he also was many, many things. Everything. He held all kind of offices. In fact, he had been vice president briefly under President Pierce, the preceding president, but he died early. He was so sick when he became vice president that they allowed him to take the oath of office in Cuba. The only guy that ever was inaugurated president, vice president out of the country. But then when he got a little better, came back to the country, he died before he could get to Washington. So he was only vice president for a few months. In fact, only about a month. But they used to call him Miss Nancy and Miss Fancy. And people laughed at him behind their backs and all. But there's no question God's little green planet that they lived together, they roomed together. When he died, Buchanan went into uncontrollable sorrow, crying and just shut himself off from the world for several months. So yeah, they were, and again, so what? In fact, Fremont came in for a lot of arguments. The Know-Nothings and the Democrats accused him of being born in Canada, therefore not eligible to be president. He was actually born in Kenya. And I sent a detective over there. His birth was uncertain. He was illegitimate. His mother had a problem with his father. His mother was married to another guy. Yeah. So he was illegitimate, as if that's his fault. The worst rumor is he was a Catholic. Oh, ho, 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 ho. And he even went to 4 o'clock Mass down at Sacred Heart, man. Okay, no, he was an Episcopalian. But anyway, the reason that rumors turned out he was a Catholic, and of course that was to make sure the Know-Nothings didn't vote for him, his father-in-law was Thomas Hart Benton, one of the most powerful American politicians of that time, who was a Democrat who voted for Buchanan, not his son-in-law, in 1856. But at first, Benton didn't like Fremont. Not that he didn't like him personally, but he knew that Army guys didn't make much money. Fremont was of illegitimate birth. He was not high society, and he didn't think he was fit for his beautiful daughter, Jessie. So he opposed the marriage, and all the ministers and all the justices of peace, all the judges in their hometown were afraid to marry them because of Thomas Hart Benton's maybe vindictiveness. But anyway, the only person that would marry Fremont and Jessie was a priest. And he married them in a civil ceremony, so they didn't have to take any vows in the Catholic Church or anything like that. But he had to live the rest of his life, including this very bitter campaign in 1856, under the claim he was a Catholic. And we never had a Catholic president until Kennedy, and we haven't had one since. So it's interesting. We've had exactly as many black presidents as we've had Catholics. And I still remember in 1960, when Kennedy won, I'm sitting there falling asleep because I'm like 1 year old. Yeah. And my mother turns to me, hey, we have a Catholic president. Now you could be president. My mother was very humble. Okay. But anyway, Fremont had to overcome all of that, and it was a very interesting election. Now, why it turns out that the Republicans do better than the Know-Nothings. Buchanan carried all the blue states. Fremont and the Republicans carried all the red states, most of the North. In fact, if Fremont had carried Pennsylvania, and he didn't, it was close, but Buchanan was what? From Pennsylvania. So if Fremont had been a better candidate, he was accused of being a little flighty, and he was. He was a little disheveled, unraveled in the mind, playing with 5 short of a 6-pack, you know what I mean? If he had been able to carry Pennsylvania and maybe Illinois or Indiana, he would have won. And the Republicans did very well, much better than they expected. He got 33% of the vote, and the Know-Nothing Party, Fillmore, he got almost 22% of the vote, as you could see over here, and that was the best percentage a third party ever got, except for Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, and really Teddy Roosevelt, the Bull Moose Party in 1912, was really a split of the Republican Party, which was the dominant party then. So I would say that the Know-Nothings in 1856 running Fillmore, they got a higher percentage of the popular vote than any party in history. The closest anybody in my lifetime ever got was Ross Perot. You remember him? When he got 19% of the vote, probably cost George Bush re-election in 1992, but that's good because it gave us Clinton and Monica and all of that stuff. All right, I love Ross Perot. He quit the Navy because they cursed. I quit tending bar because people kept ordering alcohol. What? You quit the Navy because they curse? Give me a break. Fillmore did carry Maryland, but he only one state, but he did get 22% of the popular vote, just under, so that was pretty good. So it was pretty obvious, and I have to save time, so I'm going to do it quickly. It was pretty obvious if the know-nothings in the North, and almost all the know-nothings were in the North, because that's where all the Catholics were. If the know-nothings could join with the Republicans, they could sweep in 1860, and that's exactly what happened. 70%, or maybe 80%, depending on how you look at it. Every poll is a little different, every study, but at least 70% of the know-nothings voted for Lincoln in 1860. Now, was Lincoln a know-nothing? No. But why couldn't the know-nothings go to the Democrats? Because the Democrats were pro-Irish, pro-Catholic, because what? All the Irish voted what? Democrat. So if you hated the Irish, you weren't going to join the Democrats, you joined the what? Republicans. And Lincoln knew that. And in 1860, he ran a very clever campaign where he was anti-Irish in a way, but not anti-what? Catholic. That way he kept the German Catholic vote, and he wasn't going to get the Irish vote anyway, so to hell with them. And he ran a very clever campaign. In a way, modern Republicans and don't make a big effort to get the black vote. They're not going to get it anyway. So you spend your resources elsewhere. Much as the Democrats, I'm sure, don't put much effort into Rancho Mirage or Indian Wells. Now, Desert Hot Spring. Oh, okay. How it took me a lecture and a half to do that. Now I'll get it again. How well did the know-nothings do? Were they really a threat? Amen. They not only carried 22% of the vote, but between 1854 and 1856, they elected 7 governors, 8 senators, 104 members of the House of Representatives. They totally controlled the legislatures of 6 states. So get that, 7 governors, 8 senators, 104 representatives, total control of the legislatures of 6 states. I mean, come on. They controlled the city. They were most strong in the cities where the Irish were. So if you hate the Irish, you probably lived in a what? City. So where there were Catholics, there were anti-Catholics. But anyway, they controlled many major cities, the know-nothings, in that 2-year period. For example, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, Boston, Baltimore, San Francisco, now the den of liberalism. Back then, just the opposite. They controlled New Orleans, Louisville, Cincinnati. Are you kidding me? Cities all over. Indio. So, no, I was going to say Desert Hot Springs. I spared them. All right. So what made it after 1856? This is a graduate school thing, but why did the Republicans then take over? They did a little better, but what if you would have been a betting man in 1856, it would have been 50-50. Pick 'em. Who's going to be the next great second party? Was it going to be the Republicans or no-nothings? Turned out it was going to be the Republicans. And there were 2 reasons, bleeding Kansas and bleeding Sumner. In the middle of 1856, there were 2 things that occurred that made people go more to anti-slavery in the North, go more anti-slavery than anti-Catholic. So anti-slaveryism trumped nativism. Am I making it clear? You follow me? All right, and 2 events really saved the Republicans, made it that they would overcome the know-nothings, and know-nothings would be forced to join the Republicans rather than vice versa. Follow me? Okay. One was the caning of Sumner, the Brooks-Sumner feud, bleeding Kansas and bleeding Sumner. There was an abolitionist senator. The only major abolitionist in the Senate was a guy named Charles Sumner from Massachusetts. He was Ted Kennedy's office mate. All right. Charles Sumner was a very vindictive, very vitriolic man, and he hated slavery. And he made his speech on the floor of Congress in 1856, just as the election was heating up. And if you think you're hearing some stuff yesterday and today, some bitterness, you ought to hear this stuff. All right, I was in the gallery, I know. But Sumner, he condemned slavery and anybody that owned slaves. And every Southern senator at that time And every Southern representative owned what? Slaves. So he was condemning everybody in that body that was from the South. And here's one of his lines that I learned in 6th grade. I didn't know what the hell it meant, but I knew it was something good. So I memorized, and I have never forgotten it. He looked at a senator from South Carolina, a very old man named Butler, Andrew Butler, who was very gentle. Everybody kind of liked him. Granted, he whipped his slaves, but all right. He looked at Andrew Butler, and he said, "You and all Southern slave owners, get this, are hirelings picked from the spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization." Get that one. Hirelings picked from the spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization. And you have a harlot. You've all taken, he had sexual allusions in his speech. A lot of it was sexual. And everybody knew that a lot of Northerners accused slave owners of having sex with their slave women. And he said, you have chosen several harlots, and they are all slaves. In other words, you're practicing miscegenation, mixing of the races sexually, which is going to become a big issue in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So, hirelings picked from the spew and vomit of an easy civilization. Butler said, "Ah, to hell with him." But the next day, everybody says Butler's nephew, but it was actually his cousin, a guy named Preston Brooks, very good-looking guy, Preston Brooks, young man. Preston Brooks says to Butler, who's his cousin, actually second cousin, he said, "Are you going to do anything about this SOB?" And Butler, So Brooks, who's a congressman, a representative, he goes on to the floor of the United States Senate with a gutta percha that's very hard wood. Come on, Bill, get there. Where am I going? Wrong way? Yeah. He gets a gutta percha writing stick, and he beats the living bejabbers out of Sumner right on the floor of the Senate. He gave him a concussion, probably a fractured skull. He beat Sumner so badly that Sumner could not return to the Senate for 3 years. And a lot of senators, including Stephen Douglas, stood in the background and watched. Nobody made an effort to stop him. And he beat Sumner so badly that Sumner had to go to Europe for treatment. And the people of Massachusetts made him a martyr and kept his seat vacant for 3 years till he could return. And he even kept flowers, fresh flowers, on his desk anytime the Senate was in session. Sumner, they tried to prosecute him. The Congress, they said, we're going to expel him. No, they couldn't get the votes to expel him. They tried to press charges against him. What did he do besides almost kill a guy? Nothing serious. So anyway, he said, I'll make it simple. I resign. And he went back to South Carolina. They held a special election the next month, and he won without opposition. So he was reelected and came right back to Congress. Because he broke the writing stick, he received over 150 writing sticks as gifts from grateful constituents because he almost killed Sumner. In fact, the women of Charleston, South Carolina, passed the hat around, just the women, and they gave him a writing stick with a gold crown on it. And it had inscribed on it, "Hit him again." So what did the North think about a part of the country that would make a hero out of Preston Brooks? But what did the South think about a part of the country that would make a martyr out of a man who had called them hirelings picked from this you-know-what? Amazing. So that Brooks-Sumner feud, many people now think, and I agree, that that's what pushed many people in the North to vote Republican rather than know nothing. Because now slavery, anti-slavery, is starting to trump anti-Catholicism. Fair enough? And then the other thing was Bleeding Kansas. Just as the election was getting ready to go, and just as this is happening in mid-1856, there's terrible violence in California. In Kansas, people are killed. John Brown goes out there and hacks 5 people to death. The anti-slavery people attack slavery, pro-slavery people. The pro-slavery people killed some anti-slavery people, burned down an anti-slavery town. It was terrible. So Bleeding Kansas and Bleeding Sumner convinced many Northern people to vote Republican, the anti-slavery party, rather than the American party. Fair enough? And by 1860, The Republicans have a better candidate than Fremont, though they considered nominating him again. They had a better candidate, Lincoln, that was not an abolitionist, as Fremont basically was an abolitionist. Lincoln was not. So the Republicans knew that 1856 was a glorious defeat. One Republican said, "We've scared the bejabbers out of them," and they have. Buchanan managed to hold by carrying the whole South and Pennsylvania and a couple other northern states. But the Republicans would be back. They made an amazing showing in 1856 for a party that was less than 2 years old. Amazing, and they'd be back. They'd have a better candidate, a better platform, and they would easily win in 1860, and that would cause the Civil War. Fair enough? Now, the problem is, question. Oh, yeah. And Jesse Benton ran his campaign, Fremont's campaign, and she was America's darling. And there was the power couple of the age. She was the first woman really to be a powerful political, openly, not just behind the scenes. But she couldn't do anything officially because she was a woman. And she had an IQ at least 80 points higher than his, I'll guarantee you. All right. And, of course, there's today's... I'll tell you, I'm from the Washington area. We're living in Delaware. There are rumors flying about these two. In fact, I have a video. You want to think that'd sell? Yeah. Okay. Now, Lincoln, why would Lincoln get the nomination in 1860? Lincoln was not an unknown figure, but only in Illinois. The Republicans thought about nominating him for vice president in 1856. They didn't, but his name was put in nomination. He didn't get the nomination. A lot of comparisons are made between him and Kennedy. They were both elected in 1860. Kennedy was almost named vice president in 1956. Lincoln was almost named vice president in 1856. Neither one was. There are a lot of similarities, right? Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. You ever know that? Lincoln was shot by a guy from a schoolhouse. He was shot from an assassin in a schoolhouse who was then arrested in a movie theater. Lincoln was shot in a movie theater, a regular theater, and then his assailant was killed in a barn. John Wilkes. A lot of comparisons. There's a dirty thing end to that, but I'm not going to try it. All right. But in 1858, Lincoln, who was not as unknown as some high school books would have you think, just not that well known outside of Illinois, one of the best lawyers in Illinois, and everybody said he was ugly. Where? I mean, kind of rough looking, but in a masculine sort of way, right? If anything. Mrs. Lincoln had dated Douglas before she married Abe. Aren't you jealous of her, women? How'd you like have a date with him one night? He was 6'4", he was 5'4". Mary Todd Lincoln, I don't want to say was ugly, but aesthetically challenged for sure. But she had a redeeming quality. She was a nymphomaniac who owned a liquor store. That's a Jack Palance joke. But no, Mary Todd was rich. She owned slaves, for God's sake. Mary Todd Lincoln was fabulously rich. Okay, but anyway, in fact, she, during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, was so worried about her ex-boyfriend being drunk all the time, she actually went up to him, "Steve, you got to stop drinking. You're drinking too much." And he said, "What do you mean?" Just as he walked into a wall. Okay, but anywho, Douglas was the most famous Democrat, most famous senator in the country, the most controversial because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He was the man who had engineered the Compromise of 1850, not Henry Clay, as many high school books say, but rather Douglas. Okay, so he was very, very powerful, and he was certainly eyeing the presidency in 1860. The only thing stopping him would be re-election in 1858. And the Republicans nominated Lincoln to challenge him for that Senate seat. Now, please remember, until 1914, until the 17th Amendment was passed, and it took effect in 1914, senators were not elected directly. They were elected by state legislatures. In other words, not all the people voted. You voted for people to go to the state legislature. Whichever party controlled the state legislature then elected the what? Senator. So Lincoln, you could not vote in 1858 in Illinois. You could not vote for Lincoln or you could not vote for Douglas. When you went out to vote, you were voting for legislators to the state legislature, which I guess was already in Springfield, and whoever controlled that state legislature would then elect, if the Democrats did, Douglas, if the Republicans did, Lincoln. And Lincoln, since he knew Douglas, and they were actually pretty good friends, and Lincoln's wife was honestly concerned about Douglas's terrible drinking problem, which he did have. Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of 7 debates. And there's an old theory, if you're more famous than the other guy or woman, and you're ahead or even in the polls, don't debate. Don't debate. Don't give a sucker an even break. But Douglas was so confident he could best Lincoln that he accepted. And they had 7 debates all over Illinois. So it was in 1858 when they were running for the Senate, not in 1860 when they ran again against each other for president. You follow me? So Lincoln and Douglas really ran. There were 7 debates. It's hard to say who won. Eventually, because of gerrymandering and some holdover districts, in other words, not every state legislator was up for re-election, only some of them. You know how you rotate it, or you don't elect everybody all at once, you elect some. Douglas wound up winning. It's estimated that Lincoln got it, the Republicans got about 53% of the vote, probably. It's hard to tell, but that's the best study I've ever seen. And the Democrats who were running for the state legislature got about 47%. But because of holdovers, and very few holdovers were Republicans, because there was no Republican Party really until a couple of years before this. So the holdovers tended to be Democrats. The gerrymandering, which they did back then too, the gerrymandering favored the Democrats. So even though Lincoln's Republicans probably got 5 or 6% more to vote than Douglas's Democrats, the state legislature stayed in the hands of the Democrats and they elected Douglas. But Lincoln really won because now he was a household name. These debates were covered by every major newspaper in the country. The Telegraph was now available to everybody east of the Mississippi River. So if some daily newspapers, certainly all the weekly ones, carried the news of these debates all over the country. And Lincoln was now a household word, and he became a possible contender for the Republican nomination in 1856. But please remember, the Lincoln-Douglas debates were in 1858, not 1860, when they would run again against each other for president. The first presidential debates were in 1960, Kennedy and Nixon. Right? And we never had any others until 1976 when Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford ran. Everybody thinks we had debates in 64, 68, 72. We did not. And since 76, we have had the presidential debates every year, but none until 1960. All right, now in 1860, whoever gets the Republican nomination is going to be in pretty good shape. Buchanan was a lousy president. He's usually ranked in the bottom 3 or 4 presidents we've ever had. I don't have time to get into it. He was very weak-kneed, bent over backwards, too much to favor the South, really set up the Civil War. And Buchanan wasn't even going to be renominated by the Democrats, much less win anything. So the question was, who are the Republicans going to nominate? And this was a picture taken from Harper's Weekly, which was the Time magazine of the day. Just before the Republican convention in Chicago that year. Chicago was the emerging city. This Republican convention of 1860 was the largest convention ever held in American history to that point. It was so big and so lucrative for Chicago that they built a real haphazard special building for the convention. It looked like a huge Indian teepee, so they called it the Wigwam. So this convention's held in a wigwam. Who are the Republicans going to nominate? Harper's Weekly thought it was so sure that this guy, William Seward, was going to be nominated that they put him in the center. See that? And around him, they had pictures of maybe somebody else, like Fremont and Lincoln. Okay. There were others, Simon Cameron, McLean, Cassius Clay, after whom the prize fighter was eventually named. Yeah, Cassius Clay. Remember, Muhammad Ali's original name was Cassius Clay. Well, Cassius Clay was a Republican at this point, but he was a very anti-slavery guy who had a lot of money, and he'd go around buying slaves and then freeing them. So a lot of black families, when they got freedom, named their first son Cassius. And Clay was Cassius Clay. Then he became Muhammad Ali. I met him at his training camp. His last training camp was right near my hometown. And I met him. He didn't know that. And he was very happy with me. Didn't beat me up. Okay? But then he was afraid because he knew I was Lithuanian. He didn't want to push that one. But Cassius Clay, yeah, the manumitter of slaves. So anyhow, Lincoln was a possibility. But Seward, everybody expected Seward to get nominated. But the anti-Seward people had a saying, success rather than Seward. Seward had been an abolitionist. He had made a lot of terrible speeches, not terrible, but got him in trouble. For example, he said to the Southerners that a higher law than the Constitution condemned slavery, God's law condemned slavery. I don't know where the hell he got that, because it's certainly not in the Bible condemning slavery. I said that yesterday. He also said, it was misconstrued a little, but not a lot. He said the Civil War is inevitable. He called it an irrepressible conflict. Now, here's a guy predicting a civil war. Here's a guy saying, God hates Southerners. Are you kidding me? And he was from New York. And just like people are now jealous of California, believe me, one thing, there are several states that I know of, whatever California wants, they're going to want the opposite. And when you're number one, people are going to be jealous. I'll never know that because I was never number one. But Seward was from New York. He'd been an abolitionist. He was radical. So a lot of his enemies said success rather than Seward. So if they could stop Seward, if they could stop him from getting the nomination, who do you want? Well, if you asked any one of these other people, their followers, if it's not Seward and it can't be your guy, who do you want? And almost everybody said what? Lincoln. Lincoln was everybody's second-hand rose from 2nd Avenue. In other words, the Cameron people from Pennsylvania, they said, if you can't have Cameron, who do you want? They damn well said Lincoln because he was strong on a protective tariff. The people from Indiana, if you can't have your guy, who do you want? Lincoln. Even the people from New York, if you can't have Seward, even though he's from there, if you can't have Seward, who do you want? Well, Lincoln. So Lincoln was everybody's second-hand choice. When Seward was blocked, and it was a long process, but they barely blocked Seward. It took 3 ballots to totally stop him, and then the Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln. So my one teacher said, God sent him here. Yeah, God and the people who hated Seward sent him here. Lincoln was nominated. He was not a complete unknown. He had never been an abolitionist. He was not anti-Catholic, but he very cleverly got the know-nothing vote by keeping his mouth shut and being a little anti-Irish, if not anti-Catholic. Seward, on the other hand, liked Catholics, and he proposed giving money to Catholic schools. And that was really a no-no, believe me. Why he ever said that, he had to be out of his mind politically. But anyway, Seward was stopped. Lincoln was nominated. Okay, I have time yet. And the Republicans, in my opinion, in 1860, had a great candidate in Lincoln. The party was united. Almost all the know-nothings in the North now came over to Lincoln. They weren't going to back the Democrat because the Democrats were pro-Irish, and the Irish were going to vote Democrat. So, and the Republicans, in my opinion of most historians, they wrote the greatest platform ever written in American political history. I mean that. And it was totally fulfilled. In fact, no other platform in American history was ever fulfilled like this one, except Harding in 1920 when he said, I'm not going to do anything. No, not quite. And I won't kid around by saying until 2016. I won't say that. Okay, but anyway, really a great platform. Non-extension of slavery, not what? Not abolitionists. A high protective tariff. Donald Trump was happy with that one. But that high protective tariff was a tariff on foreign goods, right? That appealed to the factory owners because that would make foreign goods more expensive. Trump understands that, right? But it would also appeal to the factory what? Workers. If I went to Detroit today and said, I'm going to put a 50% or 70% tariff on all foreign cars, would that make me good with the big executives, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler? Sure. But would it make me popular with the UAW? Sure. So the high protective tariff was very popular in the North. The South hated it, but the Republicans didn't care because they weren't going to get any what? Votes in the South anyway, so the hell with them. You don't like the tariff? Fine. We do, and that's going to carry us in the north. And believe me, that's why Lincoln carried Pennsylvania. I did many studies on that, and the tariff was a much more important issue in Pennsylvania at that time than anti-slavery, for sure. They also promised the people a Homestead Act. They promised that anybody that wanted to go west and into territories could take 160 acres, improve it for 5 years, and for a small fee, it would be what? Yours. So they screamed things like land for the landless and protection for the unprotected. That had meaning, man. If the modern parties could understand that and hit just so pithily, we're going to protect your jobs, we're going to protect American products, we're going to give you free land, and better than that, we're going to build you a transcontinental railroad to get out there. Not only are we going to give you land out west, well, how the hell am I going to get out? Well, you're going to get on the railroad and what? We're going to build you a railroad. We're going to subsidize the transcontinental railroad. Every one of these promises was kept. And on top of that, we're going to keep slavery out of the territory so white labor won't have any what? Competition. When you didn't have slave labor, white labor wages went up. When you had slavery, white labor wages went down. My God, it's a perfect that. And the reason I have an asterisk after these two, they didn't put it directly in the platform, but they really were big on it, and they did come through. They promised aid to colleges that would teach agricultural and industrial arts. These became the land-grant colleges, and every state now has at least one land-grant college. Pennsylvania's Penn State, out here it's Berkeley. All right, but every state has at least one land-grant college. That these colleges were given land grants by the federal government. The profit off them was to be used to start departments of agriculture, engineering. When I taught at Penn State on one of the campuses, the biggest college in Penn State was not liberal arts or engineering, it was the agricultural college. In fact, some politicians from Philly that didn't like Penn State, they used to call it the cow pasture college. Damn right. And if you ever were up at Penn State, you took a sniff, you'd swear there were a lot of cows and all up there. And then they also promised the national banking system. And Lincoln came through with that. If you have your national banks now, the greatest banking reform in American history up to that point and until the Federal Reserve System was started in 1913 was the creation of the national banks during the Civil War. So the Republicans promised all of this, and brother, they came through. And then in spades, in 1860, the Democrats really handed it to Republicans because the Democrats split. The Democrats North and South could not agree. The Northern Democrats wanted Douglas or nobody else. The Southern Democrats wanted anybody but what? Douglas. So the Democrats argued and argued, and the Democrats had a crazy rule, an insane rule, between 1836 and 1936 called the two-thirds rule, which said you had to have two-thirds of the delegates to get nominated, not 51%, but 67. I had a professor that always said to me, no intelligent, sane, rational party would ever have the two-thirds rule. I said, well, the Democrats had it for 100 years. He said, well, that's what I said. No intelligent... he voted for Barry Goldwater, you better believe. And I didn't argue with him when he was my professor. Yeah, yes, doctor. But anyhow, the Democrats split. The Northern, I don't have time to get in all of that, maybe next year. The Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas. The Southern Democrats nominated a guy named John C. Breckinridge, who was Buchanan's vice president. And there was a fourth party called the Constitutional Union Party, which was hastily put together as people knew that if Lincoln won, there was going to be a civil war. So a hastily put together third party was created called the Constitutional Union Party, and they just were for the Constitution. There I have to say it again. I heard it a few times this morning, but they stood for the Constitution, obedience to the Constitution, therefore preservation of the Union, therefore Constitutional Union Party. And they nominated a guy named John Bell. But anyway, Lincoln carried, I'll make it simple, as he expected, he carried Oregon and California, fine, but he carried every free state. Every free state, okay? Except New Jersey, which he split with Douglas. New Jersey could split its votes at that time, and they did. Douglas only carried Missouri and part of New Jersey. All these green states, the South were carried by Breckinridge, and the Constitutional Union Party, John Bell, carried Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And ironically, those states were the really they were slave states, but close to the north. They were really nervous about a civil war, so they voted for the compromise guy. And ironically, a lot of the battles in the Civil War, a lot of the bloody ones were fought in what? Virginia, Tennessee, and to a lesser extent Kentucky, but especially Virginia and Tennessee were ravaged, just ravaged. So maybe they saw something coming. But Lincoln, I don't know if you could read all that, but Lincoln only got 39.8% of the vote, popular vote. But by carrying every northern state, except part of New Jersey, plus the West Coast, Lincoln easily won the Electoral College. So Lincoln was elected president in November of 1860. 6 weeks later, South Carolina led the secession movement. The South said, if Lincoln's elected, we're out of here. As soon as Lincoln was elected, South Carolina started an ordinance of secession movement, and they seceded before Christmas that very same year of 1860. And eventually 11 states joined the Confederacy. Lincoln tried to stop them from seceding, and that was what we call the what? Civil War. The South was dumb. They shouldn't have called it the Civil War. They should have called it the War for Southern Independence. Because did the South have the right of secession? I don't know. We still don't know. Could Texas or California secede today? The Constitution doesn't say. But how could we deny the South the right of a war for independence? How were we created? A war for independence from England, right? So if the South played its cards right, they could have won a lot of points in the North by saying, we only want our independence. We don't want to conquer you. We only want our what? Independence. Same as us 13 colonies did, won our independence from England. So now the Republicans win in 1860. They would win every presidential election between 1860 and 1930, except 4. They would lose in 1884 to Grover Cleveland. Cleveland would lose in 88, come back and win in 92. Very close elections. That's why Trump is our 45th president, 44th man to hold the job, because Cleveland was elected twice, but what? Not consecutive. And I once sat in a graduate class where then they were paying $200 a credit. What? And we're arguing, should we count Cleveland once or twice? And I got so angry, I actually blurted out, look, Cleveland weighed 320 pounds. James Madison weighed 120. So if we count Madison once, we got to count Cleveland at least. What? I mean, I wasn't paying that kind of money to argue about, gee. Well, anyway, and then the only other Democrat elected until Franklin Roosevelt was Woodrow Wilson, who was elected in 1912, 1916, really by luck because the Republicans had split. So the Republicans would not only elect Lincoln in 1860, but virtually every president until 1932, except for Cleveland and Wilson. Fair enough? And the Republicans would be the dominant party, no question about it. And there's the popular vote. I'm sorry. Lincoln got 39.9. I said 39.8. I'm right, that's wrong. Douglas got 29, Breckinridge 18, popular vote, and Bell got only 13. Not bad, really. Okay, now the Republicans are going to dominate between 1860 and 1930. Give me 5 more minutes, I'll get you out of here. Here are the reasons. Why were the Republicans so popular and so strong? Well, they could always claim they were the party that saved the Union. They were the party that abolished slavery. Lincoln went one better, non-extension. At the end of the Civil War, slavery was what? Abolished, right? All right, it's only 2 Democrats. The GOP dominated despite the Solid South. After the Civil War, there was a period called Reconstruction. We're bringing the South back into the Union. We're reconstructing the rebel states, making them abolish slavery, and bringing them back into the what? Union. In 1876, there was a very close presidential election. And in essence, the Republicans said to the South, if you let us, in essence, steal the presidency in 1876, because clearly the Democrats won, but it was close. The Republicans said, if you give us the presidency, we'll completely end Reconstruction. South said, fine, and they let the Republican take over. What did that mean? That meant that the South, from then on until the 1970s, would be solidly what? Democrat. The South hated the Republicans, the Solid South, from the end of the Civil War, really the end of Reconstruction, until the 1970s, the South was solidly Democrat, because they hated the party of Lincoln. They hated the Republicans. And that also meant when the Republicans took the presidency, then the South was going to be Democrat, 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 because they knew darn well the white people in the South who would then take over again, they would deny the blacks the right to what? Vote. The blacks would have voted Republican, but they weren't allowed to vote. You heard of Jim Crow, right? All these Jim Crow laws come in. The greatest one was the grandfather clause, which was in effect for many years in most southern states. Everybody in the sovereign state of Mississippi could vote as long as your grandfather voted, one of your grandfathers. What? Every black guy's grandfather was a what? Slave. They weren't allowed to vote. If the grandfather clause were in effect today, I couldn't vote. Here I am, a rich white male. Lithuanian rich white male. And with a PhD from a private school. Get the idea? I lived in Palm Desert, almost Indian Wells. All right. Yeah. Where did you live in California, Bill? Right next to Indian Wells. Okay. I notice I don't say right next to you know where. Okay. But anyway, if that clause were in effect, I couldn't vote. Now, I bet you, judging by the age of some people here, I bet you couldn't vote either. My 4 grandfathers, I'm sure did not, or my 2 grandfathers, I only have 2, Bill. My 2 grandfathers didn't vote. The one I know never probably became a citizen, and the other one, unless they had a polling place in a bar room, he didn't vote either. Wasn't going to worry about that nonsense. All right, so anyway, the Republicans dominate despite the fact that every southern state voted what? Democrat for the next 70 years. Every congressman, every governor, every senator from the South was a what? Democrat. And every presidential election, 11 at least of the states were sure to be what? Democrat. And still the Republicans. What did that tell you about the rest of the country? The Republicans were very powerful in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. The Democrats to this day struggle in states like Michigan and Wisconsin. They can't figure out for the lives of them why they do. One reason is the tradition is voting what? Republican. My grandfather voted, what the hell, I will too. And that's true. All right, but the Republicans were totally dominant in the Northeast and Midwest. In Pennsylvania, the Republicans were so strong, and in Philadelphia, the Republicans were so strong until the 1940s that to keep the Democrats there as token opposition, the Republicans paid for the rent on the Democratic committee's city offices. The Republicans paid the damn rent so they'd at least be there. So they couldn't say, oh, it's not a we had competition. Yeah, a couple drunks, right? Of course, never mind. All right. The Union veterans, the Grand Army of the Republic, was a big Union veterans group. They supported the Republicans. Republicans waved the bloody shirt. I did tell you that, right? We saved the Union, like waving the flag. Not all rebels were Democrats, not all Democrats were rebels, but all rebels were what? Democrats, and vote as you shot, and all that kind of stuff. So the Grand Army of the Republic was very powerful and very Republican. In fact, by 1884, 25, now I'm not saying of the defense budget, by 1884, 25% of our budget, federal budget, was spent on veterans' pensions. Only Northerners got pensions, of course. But 25% of the federal budget went to veterans' pensions, Civil War vets. And no Southerners got pensions except maybe from their own states, but not from the what? Federal government. So come on, was the GAR important? And the GAR wielded influence right into the 1930s. I played in 2 football stadiums my senior year that were built by the GAR. And I remember going to check the dedication plaque and my coach wasn't too happy about me leaving the damn bus early to go and say, where the hell did you go, Gudelunas? I said, I went to see if this was built by the GAR. Who did he play for? He said, you think too much. That's your damn trouble. And he was a lot bigger, stronger than me. So I said, yes, sir, I won't do that again. All right. All right, I'll do it. I know people are getting antsy. These are the other reasons. I'll do it tomorrow. Is that okay? So I'm now going to talk about the Republican dominance, why it all changed during the New Deal. The New Deal of the 1930s is going to change the parties. For example, the black people, when they were allowed to vote in the North, they weren't allowed to vote in the South. But when the blacks were allowed to vote in that era, they always voted what? Republican, Party of Lincoln, right? Jackie Robinson was a Republican. Martin Luther King's father was a Republican. Blacks were traditionally Republicans until the New Deal. Okay, and so even the blacks voted Republican, the veterans, the businesses, the workers, the cities, believe it or not, the cities tended to be Republican. In 1896, the Republicans carried 28 of the 30 largest cities in the United States. What do you think it's going to be this year? Wouldn't Trump love to carry 28 of the 30 biggest cities? What are his odds in LA? Try New York. Try Philadelphia. I'm not knocking him, I'm just saying it's reality. Things change. So when did all this change? When did the blacks become Democrats? When did the cities switch from Republican to Democrat? When did this all happen? During the New Deal. The New Deal changed America like nothing ever changed America except for the Civil War. The three most important events in American history, for good and ill, in my opinion, Civil War is by far the most important. Anybody tells you anything different is crazy. And there's a tie for second and third between the New Deal and World War II. No question. No question. Okay, I'll do the rest of these quickly tomorrow, and then what am I going to do? The Republican domination reached its peak in 1904 when look at what Teddy Roosevelt did in 1904. He got almost 60% of the vote. But look, in fact, he just under. But look, he carried every state except the what? Solid South, right? So that was the peak of the Republican dominance. But I'll let you go in 1 second, between 1860 and 1930, only 2 Democrats were elected president, and really Wilson's elections were flukes. He didn't win, the Republicans lost. I had a friend that once lost to a real goofball, and my friend was really a great guy, could have been governor of Pennsylvania in my opinion. He knew it, but he wouldn't stop drinking, I'm serious. And he lost to a real idiot. And he said to me, his last words were, Billy, remember, I didn't lose. This guy didn't win, I lost. My habits beat me, he didn't beat me. And I never forgot that, never forgot that. Okay, thanks again. See you tomorrow.